Right. So, first of all, welcome to this Global Language-Based Area Studies seminar. This is the first of this year. I'm going to introduce Professor Felia Allum very shortly, but before I do so, let me just say a couple of words about what else is coming up. Now, I know that we are all aware of the strikes that are happening, and we had a talk scheduled on Wednesday the 30th of November at 1 o'clock with Helen Drake, who's talking about Brexit and Franco-British relations. And we've had to move that to Tuesday at 5 p.m. on the 29th of November. Messages will go round about that. It's in room 2.22 of the MLang building, and it is also available online, and Lel will be sending around details of that talk to everyone. There will be other seminars taking place in the second semester, and you'll get plenty of notice about those shortly. Okay. Now, in terms of Felia Allum, we're extremely grateful. We've actually had other speakers here from Bath as well, so we are doing a roaring trade on Bath University, and we are extremely grateful. As you will have seen from the blurb, Felia is an incredibly internationally renowned scholar in a whole series of areas: transnational crime, organised crime, the mafia. I've got a list of the topics as well: gender, Italian politics, European politics, anti-organised crime policies, and has published 2 monographs and a plethora of articles and chapters, as well as securing a number of important grant bids, the last of which from the Leverhulme has just come to an end. And I think I'll let Felia talk to you about that and some of the findings that come out of that talk. So do ask your questions via the Q&A function. We will get a chance at the end to ask questions, perhaps live in live terms, but please start to prepare your questions via the Q&A if you possibly can. So over to you, Felia, and I'll switch off my mic and video. Okay,
thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you very much to your team at Cardiff for inviting me to start to present some of the findings, as you mentioned, from the Leverhulme project, which I have just finished, although I wouldn't necessarily say it's finished. Really, it's finished in real terms in terms of data collection, but now I'm kind of mulling over what I have to say. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this works. Okay, and I've been asked to sort of try and keep this to 20 minutes, so I will try and go through what I've prepared for you and sort of give you a kind of a broad sense of what I've been doing and a broad sort of overview. So the initial project was called Transnational Organised Crime, an Equal Opportunity Employer, because from my previous kind of research, it struck me that we know quite a lot about the roles of women and gender in terrorist groups, but we tend to know very much less about the role of women in organised crime groups, and the picture that we have is not really clear. It's quite fragmented. So I was very fortunate in 2017 to be given a 3-year fellowship with the Leverhulme to do some more substantial work into this particular question. So what I'd like to do now is just to give you a very brief overview of some of the issues that I encountered, some of the questions that I asked myself, and then to give you a certain sense of the empirical data that I collected. I don't think I expected the theoretical questions, the methodological questions, to be as important as they turned out to be. The case studies are important, and I'm still working on them because I'm an empiricalist fundamentally. I like to kind of really link in the theory to the empirical data. In the space of organised crime, sometimes that's actually quite complicated because there is very little data, or the data is very difficult and complicated to access. So this is more or less the plan that I have with you today, to sort of try and elaborate these ideas and these thoughts, and I hope that they might provoke some questions and some ideas for you as well. So I've been on a journey for the last 25 years. I trained as a political scientist initially, but my journey has been very much into this space of organised crime, which some people try or started to talk about in terms of a discipline in itself. It's a very interesting space because we come from very different kinds of backgrounds, and we also have very different kinds of lenses when we look at these different problems. Over the last 25 years, I've predominantly focused on Italy and Italian organised crime and La Camorra in Naples. And I've tried to look at different aspects. Initially, my PhD was on the political relationship with this group. I then started to look at anti-organised crime groups across Europe, and also in relation to Italy. And then in 2011, I was very lucky to be given a full year sabbatical from the University of Bath, which allowed me to go back to my roots, which allowed me to go back to look at the Camorra in more detailed. I was appointed in Bath in 2002, and between 2002 and 2011, apart from having 2 maternity leaves, I really hadn't had time to go back to Naples, to Campania, and have a look at what was going on. I was fully immersed in my teaching and my admin, and therefore that 2011 was a turning point because it allowed me to really go back and get a sense of what was going on. I wrote a book off that sabbatical, which I've put a little picture here, called The Invisible Camorra, which I published with Cornell University Press. And basically I tried to trace the journeys and the movement of Neapolitan criminals across Europe, in France, the UK, Germany, Spain and Holland. It was a very difficult research project in the sense that basically Europe is, one, perhaps not interested in understanding Italian mafias, and two, there is actually very, very little data. I initially started to talk to British police officers about the Italian mafias, and they actually didn't know what it looked like, and they had no sense of what was going on. So the book was really quite difficult to write, but very interesting because up until now, we'd had a sense of how the Cosa Nostra was moving around. We have a sense of how the Calabrian groups moved around. But when it came to the Camorra, there was very little being said. And what was also interesting was actually it moved in a different way. It had less available diasporas compared to the Calabrians. It was much more functional. It was much more business-based. And the more it moved away from Naples, the more liquid it became and less recognizable. So in 2017, when I applied for this Liverpool Major Research Fellowship, I didn't expect to get it, and I got it, which, as I was saying to Gordon before, changed my life, changed my world, and changed my perceptions and my way of looking at things. So I went back to look at gender because looking at the Camorra up until then, I'd always come across women, but I always came across women as a kind of described in a very marginal and negative way. In other words, women were seen but or were not seen and not heard, and they were very irrelevant. So much so that a journalist, Claire Longridge, talks about a ruling in 1986, if I remember correctly, from Palermo, where a woman was not condemned for mafia association because she was considered incapable. In other words, she just didn't have, according to the judge, the intellectual capacities to participate in this criminality. So there were certain things that sort of disturbed me around that, and I wanted to go back and have a look. However, I would move away from Italy in this project. I would look more at transnational organised crime groups. I would look more in terms of a comparative analysis. So I ended up looking at different types of groups, and I wanted to understand whether they were sexist. Now, this question can be problematic, what I mean by sexism and what do we actually mean. And I also think that the question I was trying to look at is whether crime groups were actually being silenced, or were actually silencing women by intent or by design, or neither. So I really kind of had to get a grip around what the women were doing and how they were actually navigating these spaces, these criminal spaces, which obviously have been defined very much as masculine, illegal spaces. So all this was kind of, questions that I was throwing at myself. The idea of gender inequality in crime groups, were girls and boys different from each other, and how did their activities differ to a great extent? And one of the things that struck me slowly was the idea that actually gender is very much constructed when we look at organised crime, and that we need to sort of really go bottom up. In other words, we really need to move away from the existing police and judicial data to try and understand exactly what is going on. So I just want to sort of briefly say what the literature was telling me in terms of analysis and in terms of trying to sort of as a starting point. Well, one of the first starting points that is a real problem in this area is how we define organised crime. As I've pointed out previously, there are lots of different individuals or different academics looking at organised crime, and we never necessarily use the same disciplinary tools, and we never necessarily use the same lens. I'm a European white woman who comes at it from a specific angle with a specific history and a specific training. Somebody who might be an economist or an anthropologist might have a different approach and a different history and a different experience. So we never agree on what organised crime is. We tend to sort of push it to one side in a sense because it is a very problematic term. A lot of people understand what they mean by organised, but they don't necessarily understand what they mean by crime and vice versa. Do we look at street gangs? Do we look at Italian mafias? Do we look at crime syndicates? It's very, very difficult. So in this project, I adopted a very broad approach in order to be able to include a lot of different types of crime groups. And I decided to look at Italian mafias, Nigerian crime groups, and Albanian-speaking crime groups. COVID meant that I couldn't look at the Chinese groups in much detail, and I also wanted to look at French and British crime groups. So I've ended up looking at British crime groups, Italian crime groups, and 2 transnational organised crime groups, those that are moving from Nigeria and the West Balkans. The other thing that was probably problematic and very difficult and a challenge throughout this is that basically criminology, but not only, other disciplines as well, are very male-centric. In other words, it's about men doing crime studied by men. There is a very little acknowledgement, in particular in organised crime, much more in the gang literature, around the fact that there is a kind of male-centric look and lens to look at these areas, which means that women are again put to the background and marginalized and considered irrelevant, when if we go and have a look, the situation is more nuanced and more complicated. Added to which, I just need to add here the idea that when they do see women, when women are seen, they're very much seen as victims and lacking any notion of agency. So this is the general kind of problem around criminology. And as I said, I don't think it's only a problem that exists in criminology. When we come and look at organised crime, there is a lot of literature on women, gender and organised crime, but it's very fragmented. The one big thing that we can see is that organised crime is considered very much a space where gender inequality exists, male-only space where women have no role, women have no responsibilities, and women have no voice and presence. So they're seen as marginal, they're seen as irrelevant, incapable, all these kind of quite negative undertones that are given to the role of women. And the theories tend to back it up to a certain extent. So there's been some studies on the nature of the criminal market as being the factor, the variable that defines women's roles, i.e. the constraints of the market mean that women are less likely to participate because perhaps you need more skills or perhaps you need different kinds of skills. So there's one study undertaken by Zhang in 2007 where he looked at human trafficking, and he identified the fact that human trafficking, there was less violence involved, and therefore with less violence you had more women using soft skills. So here it was the idea of the market perhaps being an important determining variable. Other people have looked at human trafficking networks as well in relation to this, looking at the crime groups and looking very much at the role of women. So here in the human trafficking crime groups, again, it was around the role of madams, and the role of madams as just being pimps, and it was the criminal network and the way the network was organized which could help explain why women were less visible and involved. And then when it comes to Italian mafias, very much the whole kind of picture is one which seems to suggest that men control the crime groups and that women are excluded, whether because the men exclude women because they think that they're unreliable, or whether because there is a certain element of misogyny taking place. So my project, as I said before, was about looking at two different domestic groups. So I look at the Italian context and the British context, and then I look at the Albanians and the Nigerians and how they live in these 3 countries, how they move in these 3 countries, and where the women are. So it's a complicated picture to a great extent, but fundamentally I just wanted to understand what it was, what we needed to look at in order to explain whether women were less involved or not. And my methodology to do this has always been very much a kind of more ethnographic approach. In other words, it's about talking to people, interviewing people, and really getting a sense of what's going on, rather than using purely secondary data, police data, and police and judicial reports. Again, one of the things that has not really been acknowledged when we look at organised crime is that a lot of the data is actually collected by men, and therefore might firstly explain the idea of a male gaze when it comes to look at organised crime. In other words, it's very much a male community of law enforcement agents who are putting together data in order to carry out trials, and to do that they obviously are very focused on making sure that there is somebody who will be condemned. Having said that, their description of the criminal underworld is one that basically ignores the role of women. We don't really have a gender specific data collection process, and this happens across my different fields or my different sites of collection of data. So in the UK, this is a problem. In Italy, this is a great problem, and also in France. In other words, we're not looking at women in a different way. We're just sort of looking at men or looking for men. So in order to try and capture as much activity of women, I decided that it would be very interesting to talk to women across the board, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's former criminals and people working in the local community, to try and get a better sense and a clearer sense of where they were within that illegal criminal space. The methodology that I adopted was a grounded theory approach, which meant that I was collecting data to then put the theory together afterwards, which obviously is very challenging and not very, very easy. But I thought it was the most realistic way of trying to put this together, because there is so little data in terms of, as I say, the numbers and the ideas behind what women do in these different kinds of organised crime groups. So I was able to identify different scenarios, different case studies, and I've been trying to put all these different kind of pictures together. So where does that leave me in some of my case studies? So I looked at the British context to try and understand where the women were within this criminal space, because the women are there, but they have very perhaps of invisible roles, perhaps is one way of identifying that. So when I looked at the British context, in different spaces women were present. So in the drug related communities, whether it's people selling drugs, people taking drugs, people enforcing different types of criminal behavior, women are very present, and in particular girls are very present, and yet they're not necessarily captured by the traditional picture. So in gangs or street gangs or youth gangs, in drug lines, we can see that young women are present, and usually they're seen as victims, which is fair enough, but at the same time they can also use that victimhood and transform it into their own agency to try and get out and to try and cope and to try and survive these kind of difficult situations. So we see women present in all different aspects, as I said, the local street level, but also local crime families. The women are very present, the wives and the mothers are very present in helping push different kinds of criminal agendas, and then also in the invisible drug networks, where there's obviously very little data that is available to understand whether and how women are active. It is clear that the picture that we have from the British kind of context is either that we have women who are involved and who like the lifestyle, or women who are victims to the vulnerabilities that are created by the crime setup. What is clear is that the discourse and the language that is used around women is very negative. And I would say very unhelpful, because we're not really getting a sense of the true reality of the picture. And one of the things that struck me, the more I looked at the information, the more I interviewed individuals, is that wherever I turned, there was a consistent variable that kept coming back to me, and consistent issue that kept coming back to me, which is very much the idea that women don't have their own agency. In other words, here, women in these spaces are seen eventually, are looked at and considered eventually, but they are seen that they are agencyless. In other words, they are controlled by a bigger hand. They are part of a process which is very complicated. And what I was interested actually to see and to prove is that actually these women do have agency. They navigate that illegal space. They do have their own agency, and they're not just representatives of men or an extension of the men, which is the picture that we tended to have. So the criminal underworld in the UK is a really interesting one. It's very disorganized, it's very random, it's very, very violent at the different kinds of levels. The further up we go, the drug chains, the more sophisticated it is, trying to recycle money into the legitimate economy. The one thing that I did notice, though, and again, it came back into all the different kind of contexts that I was looking at, is the idea and the importance of the family structure for the well-running of the different kinds of crime activities. So the young women who were vulnerable in the drug lines and in the local drug spaces were very much abandoned by their families, or had fallen out with their families and made them very, very vulnerable. So family was something that kind of struck me, also in relation to looking at Italian organized crime. So the last case study I quickly want to sort of ponder on, and then I'll stop here, is also the Nigerian groups that, if we look at the data in Italy, are very, very extensive, very, very present. In the UK, there are traces and there are footprints of them, but again, we're not necessarily looking for them. We don't necessarily know what they look like. In Nigeria, these groups are called Nigerian Cults. They have a long history in the post-colonial Nigerian situation. Since the 1960s, they've developed on student campuses, and slowly they've evolved into very violent political machines, helping the political establishment get elected, and they're presented very much as male-only organizations in Nigeria, with having female equivalent groups that do the similar kind of activities. Their major characteristics that they got rituals, they have an affiliation ritual which is linked to a specific act. They also are very how can I say this, they're very involved in the different kind of criminal activities, and in particular drug trafficking and human trafficking. Human trafficking is one of their main activities, where they traffic young women and young men across Europe. They indebt them, they put them into severe debt, and these poor victims have to try and pay off their debt. And the portrayal we have of coming from Nigeria is that they're very kind of male orientated, and they put women into sexual exploitation and into modern slavery. And again, what was interesting from my perspective is the more that I went down and had a look at these organizations, the more that I actually saw that actually there were women involved, although they present as male only. They don't necessarily engage and talk about women being involved. But if we go and have a look at these cults in particular detail, so I spent time in Castelvolturno, just outside Naples. They're now very active in Marseille, and the footprint that we have across the UK is very much related to human trafficking in particular, and the prostitution of young women into these kind of different activities. Women are involved, and women are not only madams, which is the main picture that we have of women in relation to these Nigerian cults. So what was interesting, again, from my perspective, is that if I broke it down to look at these different cults, there were women, there were wives who were involved just as much as their men. But if you had a look at the judicial data didn't really include them, or didn't really kind of get a sense that they were actually involved or helping. So those are my kind of case studies to just give you a sense of where I'm coming from and how complicated it is. But at the same time, I'm still asking myself the question whether the organizations are blocking the advancement of women, or whether perhaps it's society that has an image of these groups, and it's a society that projects an image on of how they should behave. And actually these groups are profit making machines, interested in money at all cost, and therefore it actually might not be too intelligent to not use women or not get women involved, because ultimately women are also very intelligent, they're very savvy, and actually sometimes they're much better at doing these different activities than the men. So just some kind of concluding remarks, and I hope I've kind of given you an overview and perhaps provoked some ideas or some thoughts in relation to this. Obviously I've kind of tried to make it as simple as possible. So the question of equal opportunity employer, I think, is an interesting one, because a lot of people talk about a glass ceiling, people talk about a glass elevator, and I think that actually these groups are probably very much equal opportunity employers, and that there actually is less gender inequality in the groups than we actually believe, because ultimately they're interested in money and they're based very much on blood ties and families. Perhaps it's our society and the societies as a whole that project the inequalities that we see, or our misconceptions or our stereotypes, and therefore perhaps we have to look at local gender systems to understand how these criminal groups work, rather than having very general ideas around why women should be excluded, because from my research it was very clear that they weren't necessarily excluded as we thought. They weren't irrelevant, they were actually part and parcel of what was going on. So how much is it about the groups and how much is it about society is something that I'm still trying to get my head around. It's clear that there is not one model that fits all to explain all these different kind of dynamics, but I still think that the cultural context, the historic socioeconomic context probably can explain more about a crime group than necessarily these very general ideas around the market, around the groups, and around the economy. And I think if that's okay, I'll stop here, and I hope I've given you some idea of where I'm at and what I've been getting up to. I look forward to having some questions if possible. Thank you very much for your time.
Oops. So, am I visible now? I seem to have lost my screen. Oh, yes, I am. Okay. So thank you so much. I mean, that really was absolutely fascinating. Now, as always happens here, we don't get people writing in the Q&A or the chat. So we have to invite people to speak or write, and either I or Andrew has to allow them to talk, which we can do. Andrew, I mean, I know you mentioned you had one or two questions. Do you want to kick off with a question? I've got a couple of questions up my sleeve as well, and then hopefully one or two people can put their names forward.
Yeah, my question is a bit more of a methodological one, really, because you mentioned that data access can be quite hard in your field, and that makes sense. So during the process of your research, did you have to alter your research design at all whilst you were maybe unexpectedly?
So I think it's a really interesting and valid question. Just to say that with my previous project, where I had a year from the University of Bath, I don't think I altered, but I had just had to really think on my feet, in the sense that I did expect every country in Europe to have some idea about Italian mafias. And when they didn't, I just had to say, right, I've got to therefore go from Italy, go from Naples and follow the stories out. Here, I had a sense that there would be little data, which is why when I did my general application to the Leverhulme, it was very much about women's voices. I got a sense that there would, I am surprised at the lack of, there is a big gap around gender specific data. So I was more surprised, but I'd already kind of gone into the idea, and there's quite a lot of similar studies across the board around putting women back into the foreground of the discussion rather than to the background, because we're not capturing them and we need to listen to them. I didn't mention, but over those last 25 years of studying the Italian Camorra, the Neapolitan Camorra, I had been fortunate enough to interview 6 or 7 former criminal women. And that therefore informed my understanding that really, you know, we need to talk to women, but we also need to talk to former criminals, obviously with the caveat that sometimes they just tell us a lot of rubbish. Obviously they want to tell us their story, but I was lucky enough to really kind of get some sort of quality time with the former criminals, whether men or female, to really sort of try and unpack that, because it's only by listening to those who are in the middle of it that I think we're going to have a sense of what's really going on. So it didn't alter it dramatically. I was aware of the difficulties. It just kind of reinforced where I was going. I was shocked. I didn't expect gender to be such a major problem. Maybe I was naive.
Okay, thanks very much, Felia, for that. We've got a question here from Liz, which Liz Renone, whom I know you know, fellow Italian. So actually, we get 2 questions from Liz. Thanks for a wonderful paper, Felia. Did the gender dynamics map onto those of the local areas, i.e. was there variation across micro regions? And then she's added a second question, so I may as well put that forward straight away. how did the interviewees respond to you as a female researcher, given the context you gave about this being a topic that has been studied about men and by men?
So if I can answer the second question first, I think I think first of all it's very difficult to whereas the work that I've done on the Neapolitan Kilmora means that I've kind of been able to build up quite a long a relationship with my communities, with whether it's Italian or whether it's Neapolitan, and that takes time. I was lucky to interview not as many women as young girls as I would have wanted to, but clearly there is something around kind of women synergies and women looking and talking and looking the same and being kind of, you know, the same gender. So there was a response, and I think there was also an acknowledgement that this was an area that needed to be talked about. There is an area, and in specifically the idea of agency, the specific idea that, you know, women can have agency. That agency doesn't necessarily mean that the behavior is positive or negative, right? But there is a tendency of kind of never giving women their agency. And again, a couple of weeks ago, I was interviewing a guy from the National Crime Agency, and we had, you know, the ultimate conclusion was that some institutions are misogynistic because when they do see women, they just don't give them that agency. It's a kind of, you know, they're being controlled, coercive control. Women just don't have the capacity. And I think that for me was really problematic to sort of focus on. So with my interviews, a lot of these women were saying these kind of things, and therefore wanted to say, wanted to share, wanted to sort of say, yes, maybe we need to get the dynamics, we need to focus on the different dynamics now, because that means that there are a whole group of women we're not talking about, those who do have agency, who do bad things, but for reasons that we really need to understand. In terms of the kind of gender dynamics, I'm kind of still working this out, because the difficulty I have is that when I look at the West Balkans, the big image that we have is that it's very macho, and that it's kind of, you know, women are excluded, and yet the data that I'm looking at, which is limited, is showing me that actually women are there, women do have space, and women do have time to get involved and to want to get involved. But the predominant narrative, the master narrative, is of victimhood, is about women being victims of prostitution, being victims of human trafficking, which is there, no doubt about it, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a certain level of complicity where the mothers perhaps of the young men who are doing this are not aware and couldn't stop it. So I'm still trying to really work on that kind of local element and that local gender variation. I'm just saying we need to look at it rather than have this kind of general approach of sort of saying, oh, it's the criminal market, so, you know, we don't see women in drug trafficking because it's violent. Well, actually, if you go and have a look, you know, yeah, there are women who are involved in high-end drug trafficking. In the 'Ndrangheta, we have a lot of women who are involved. It's just we're not capturing them because we think it's a male-orientated activity. So I'm just trying to sort of, I suppose, think in a different way, think in a way that perhaps can explain a bit more.
Excellent. We haven't got, well, Rogers, we have got another question. I was going to slip one in myself, but okay, Tillman, excellent. So do you want to read this actually, Andrew, Tillman's question?
Of course. So they say, really interesting synthesis. Thank you, Felia. Could you elaborate on what flavor of grounded theory you used and how you implemented it in practice? Kind of more specifically, how did you move from open coding to a selective coding to build the theory? And did you draw on a particular coding scheme? And did you utilize software like in Vivo?
So first of all, why I was generally attracted to the grounded theory approach, which obviously from what the question you're asking is much more, your approach is perhaps much more detailed than mine, was that for the long time I always found that there was a big gap between theory and data. In other words, I've got the impression, and I do believe that there are sort of certain communities of academics that tend to have a theory that they try to apply to the theory, to the data that they find, regardless of the difficulty of the nature of the data. So for me, I just tried initially, and this is kind of throughout my research career, I have tried to apply and to implement and to use certain theories. It just didn't fit. So for me, the logical sort of result was to go and approach and try a grounded theory approach. And as I've said, it's not an easy approach. It's a very complicated one because you're perpetually trying to capture the data and then question it and go through it and code it, as you say. My coding has been really kind of quite simplistic to a certain extent because I wasn't able to do anything too complicated because of the cross-country data that I was collecting. The data was uneven to a certain extent in certain areas where it was my data set was basic ethnographic interviews compared to other locations where I was able to use ethnographic interviews to combine and to complement judicial police reports. So the coding made it much more difficult from that perspective. So for me, it was very much kind of a period of collection of data and of trying to figure out what theoretical approach might be able to explain or understand the kind of different dynamics, and therefore having these different kind of data sets, they were so difficult that sometimes it was very difficult to necessarily code in a straightforward way. It was more a question of trying to look at different theories, trying to look at the data that I had, the different themes that were recurring, the different points that were coming out, and to see whether I could put them together to understand and to ultimately say that, you know, I don't think that these organizations are necessarily as sexist as we think. I think that we're not necessarily asking the right questions, looking at the right data, or talking to the right people. And I think we need to challenge the kind of stereotypical or the gender norms that we have to sort of say, oh, you know, why do we look at leadership? We think leadership is really important, but by looking at leadership, we're only looking at men. That automatically excludes the women. But the women are helping, are giving advice, are looking and to be proactive. And yet then when we look at the leaders, we say, oh, well, that's just the family, that's irrelevant. Well, why are we saying the family is irrelevant when the family is an important social structure? In Italy, perhaps, in Nigeria, in the West Balkans, in the UK, the nuclear family is much more in a difficult position, it seems to me. And therefore, I think that can really also try and explain why perhaps in the UK, there's much more misogynistic attitudes that are taking place in crime families because the structure of the family is weakened compared to other contexts. I don't know whether that's answered your question, but I hope it's given you some sense of what I've did.
Okay, that is a really good answer as well. I think I can ask a question now, but we'll still get time for other people to throw in a few questions. I was going to ask about your conceptual framework as well, but I think you've kind of covered that to a large extent as well. Also, it did occur to me that there is this concept of agency, and then as soon as you talk about agency, you talk about agency and structure and where are we here, and I think that's what you're grappling with as well. But within that, just to kind of do women have levers to pull? Do they, you know, is there if they're not getting the recognition and support or positions that they're required? So because when we talk about the glass ceiling, we talk about all these other things, there are complaints procedures in the normal, not that I'm saying they work particularly well or whatever else, but there are levers. And is that something that is going on there? And I'm also wondering about the dynamic of women not being sentenced. Could that be, so that's clearly that the male enforcement officers are regarding them as, you know, low down the hierarchy, not having competence. But could it also be that people are not informing on them? In other words, informants inform on men and not on women. Is there have you found any of these kind of dynamics going on in your study? I
mean, I found all kinds of aspects that perhaps were a lot of aspects where the gender, the question of kind of womanhood was being put into question or was being treated differently. So let me just give you two examples before I come back to your first question. One obviously is, as you say, I came across a lot of cases in the UK where women were local drug dealers, but they were also mothers. And the moment that they got into court, they were being punished both for being a mother and being a drug dealer, compared to a man who's only being judged as a drug dealer, not the fact that he's also the father of 5 kids. So you've got those dynamics. And then I spent a lot of time with the youth offending team, the local youth offending team, to try and get a sense. And I know that, you know, when I started the conversation with them back in 2018, they didn't have a lot of young women. Now, obviously, my conversations with them meant we've looked at and we've carried on looking at young women, and I'm due to go and spend some more time with them, whereas they're now saying we're not seeing the young women again. And I'm like questioning and saying, is it that you're not, are they, you know, they say we don't have any young women. I said, but are you looking for them, and how are you looking for them? And I remember one of the first cases that they kind of got me to look at was how basically a young woman who's very vulnerable, who had loads of kind of issues, had done some form of criminality. And when the social worker, all she wanted to do was to say, make sure she didn't go to prison, because that would start a whole series of other forms of behavior. But her problem was, because the judge didn't see women very frequently, when he did see a woman or a young girl, then again, it was going to be a double whammy. So we've got all these kind of inconsistencies about, you know, seeing women and then knowing what to do with them, or being aware that, you know, we can see they're there and how we deal with them. In terms of levers and kind of pressure that women can put, I think part of the stuff that I want to come back and to formulate, and I'm trying to finish a monography in particular in relation to Neapolitan women, is to have a look at the private space, because we tend to kind of juxtapose the private and public space and sphere, and basically conclude that these are dominated by men at all cost, when actually, if you go and have a look at the Neapolitan context, the mothers, the women dominate that space very much, but we ignore that to our peril. And therefore, I think that women do have negotiation, do have space to negotiate because of their role in the family, but also the capital that they gain from other kind of social situations. And this is not only for Neapolitan women, but across the board, the women that I was talking to are sort of saying, you know, we're much more intelligent than men. We know how to sort of, you know, dodge and deal. We know how to survive. That's not to say that there aren't situations of domestic abuse where women get caught up in horrific violence, but initially there's very much a kind of social and human engagement where, you know, they can influence the men. They do have the capacity to influence and to shape their behavior. And the problem, I think, is that the lens that we use is a male lens at all cost at every level, and that can be kind of a positive and a negative. My last point would be, you know, in terms of the Italian mafias, I would argue that they very much used this idea, or the understanding that women are not being picked up, and that's why we can see women heavily involved in money laundering, because nobody thinks to have a look at the bank account of the wife, or nobody thinks that the old grandmother who's in the background not saying anything might actually be willingly accomplice to having her name on the last the last house they've bought or the car they've bought. So the dynamics are kind of, you know, are really interesting, but I just think that society, once again, we're behind, you know, the criminal synergies, because they've understood, you know, the simplistic way that we sort of think, oh, men strong, women weak, and therefore women not part of it.
That's fascinating. There aren't any. I've got another couple of questions, but I wanted to throw it open. I know that, Andrew, you've got another question as well.
Yeah.
Anybody, David or Catherine or anybody in the audience, Anna, you're all there. You'd be more than welcome. But you ask your question, Andrew, if you've still got a question. Yeah.
I was thinking about kind of what you were just saying there about men strong and women are seen as weak. And do you think that some of these groups may be trying to project masculinity in a form of intimidation, maybe?
I don't know whether it's as a form of intimidation. I think that's, for them, it's the norm. It's the idea very much that, you know, we project our masculinity and therefore, you know, the femininity, it doesn't exist, or is invalid. And I know that, you know, across the board, if we have a look, we acknowledge the femininity, but we don't necessarily acknowledge also the masculine aspect, or we disdain the one for the other. I mean, there's one particular group in the outskirts of Naples where, you know, the women are very feminine. There's no doubt about it, but they also use masculine values and tools, etc., when are necessary, and therefore there's a play on both in that. And that's why, again, the idea of sexual difference and the differences between the sexes, I wonder how much is a construction than an actual reality, to sort of have a look and say, actually, there's more similarities between men and women than actual differences, and yet we're going always for the differences of saying, oh, you know, the women are physically weak. Well, they might be physically weak, but that doesn't mean that they can't be psychologically violent, you know, that there aren't other aspects that they can use. So I find it really fascinating to see how, you know, there's this kind of norms that we construct, and then there is the reality of the fluidity of gender identity and the gender roles, and that, you know, there is an idea of masculinity at a certain point, but I don't know whether it kind of exists so kind of systematically, kind of perhaps is more fluid than we think. The other thing that just to bear in mind, which is also an interesting development, is that we're getting now 2 or 3 members of different Italian mafias in particular who are transgender, and who are also not necessarily are also homosexuals. And I think that's really interesting, because we have this, on the one hand, this kind of outside kind of, you know, rhetoric about masculinity, about heteronormative society, and yet within their ranks there's an acceptance. There's not necessarily this kind of, you know, expelling of individuals, because, you know, it all serves the greater good. And therefore, if you have a member, I'm not saying that's systematically the case. There are, I mean, there is one case in Naples where there is a young woman, there's a young woman who became a man and who's been murdered, but we're still waiting to see exactly what the dynamics are. 10 years on, it's not clear whether whether she got involved in or he got involved in something that was beyond him, or it was actually a targeted violence because of his journey. That's still not clear, but there's a lot of fluidity, I think, that we need to sort of take into account and recognize, rather than necessarily just stick with this kind of very straight, you know, yes, no kind of society, traditional society that we have around gender.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, it does occur to me as well that, I mean, I don't know how you managed to get this through your ethics committee, because that must have been a challenge. But so there's that as a challenge. But I'm also wondering about the kind of ethical issue here of you're kind of looking at how women have enough agency, but effectively to get involved in crime, you know? So does that come up as a kind of, you know, you're measuring, I suppose, how much agency they've got in committing crime, and you're kind of pointing out that maybe they should be, you know, higher up in the ranking. But is there an ethical dilemma there that you've come across, or?
So in terms of ethics, I must admit I probably got slightly lucky in the sense that this project went through in 2017, when ethics only started to become much more kind of important. But I still had discussions with, obviously, the ethics committee in my faculty, probably because they were also not kind of, it wasn't necessarily the type of research that they would do, because for me it's problematic to necessarily kind of, you know, have a consent form and start to sort of say, will you sign my consent form, when, you know, you really are building a relationship around trust and around kind of very trust, and to know that, you know, the information that you're going to use or going to be given is used in a very delicate way, and not necessarily, I mean, you know, I probably haven't published as much as I could have, because a lot of the stuff that I just don't want to publish. You know, I could have easily done that, but I think that there's a lot of respect around the people who shared their experiences with me. But I still, yeah, I think you've got a point about the ethics, and for me, I was very lucky. I think if I did the project now, I would have real difficulty to explain. I don't know whether it's because I do research differently from my colleagues in my faculty, to sort of talk about, you know, going into communities, working with community groups. You can't just sort of necessarily hand out the consent form straight away. There needs to be a very much a personal relationship that develops and builds up to then sort of say, right, you know, can I have a conversation with the people who come to your social group, and how can I, you know, and to sort of talk it through. The stuff that I do write is libel read, and a lot of it is anonymized in order to protect. So I do kind of have my own kind of ethical kind of guidelines, but I did sort of, sometimes I feel that it's very difficult for certain ethical kind of committees to sort of really engage and to sort of become very bureaucratic. I mean, there was a point when I started to sort of say, you know, it's thank God all of it went through before, because this last bit, you know, where you sort of, there's a lot of bureaucracy which doesn't help more ethnographic kind of studies, I think.
That's really good. Now, does anybody have a question? We're going to be wrapping up shortly. We've got a few minutes left before people start making their way to another class. I mean, I could ask one last thing, which is about, I had a couple of questions. One was about the transnational versus the national. So these are transnational organizations engaging in both national and transnational crime. Is there a kind of sense in which women are, because I mean, in my mind, I tend to think of women smuggling drugs through airports and obviously falling victim in that way. Is there a certain transnational role that is seen as particularly reserved for women, or is it, are there kind of particular roles that lend themselves to, you know, women being given them?
Yeah, that's also part of kind of trying to get to the end of what I'm doing, to sort of see whether, you know, I can start to sort of identify those kind of patterns. One thing that I kind of said in what I said to you in my presentation was I think I'd underestimated the importance of the family. So even in the Nigerian cult groups, that are groups that, you know, they don't seem to be in any way based on family. There are wives who are involved. There are mothers who are, you know, there's a whole kind of invisible familial network that we're just not picking up because we're looking at the leadership. We're looking at kind of male kind of, you know, relationships, rather than saying, hang on a second, you know, the wife is actually involved. And again, it's easy to understand in the sense that, you know, I was looking at an investigation on Nigerian cults in Rome. Now, the people who are putting that investigation together are more likely to be men than they are to be women, and therefore their interest is to get the leader, not to actually look that the leader is actually helped by his wife, who's also doing just as bad as him, or to his mother, who's also putting the money aside. So, you know, there are different kind of roles and responsibilities that one can have a look at. But I think that from my perspective, I was surprised by the nature of the family still as a predominant variable that kind of helps and gives power to women because of their role in the household. Not only economic, I think also other kind of not only economic, but also in terms of their blood ties, in terms of their, you know, their kind of relationships. And I just still think, you know, we are dominated by male terms and male conceptions of everything, which means that we easily fit into this kind of male gaze and male understanding, and we're sort of perhaps a bit lazy to say, why, what happens if we were to turn it over and have a look and see where the women are and eliminate the men? What does that look like? Is it just a kind of no criminal underworld, there are no women? Or actually the women are sort of in the shadows. So women are able to do everything. And even the idea of violence, I think, is an interesting one, because a lot of people have argued that, well, you know, women aren't involved in crime because they're not involved in violence. Now, maybe they're not, their aggression is different to those of men, but I still think that women are able and capable, are just as evil, and have the capacity to undertake violence if they feel like it, or if they want to. But as a mafia woman said to me, former mafia woman said, I don't need violence, you know, I've got my foot soldiers who'll do it for me, I just need to order them. So they put themselves in a place where they don't need to, because they've got that kind of intelligence to know where to sort of place themselves to avoid getting caught. But yeah, I mean, hopefully by the end of this, I'll be able to sort of say, yeah, we have a tendency of finding women more visible at this level. I talk about partners, really, that we know that we sort of don't see them, and I think that we need to perhaps rehabilitate and look at their partnerships, and that men don't do things on their own. And I think the criminal underworld is perhaps different from the Masons. I haven't looked at the Masons, where we're told it's just male only. But I think we need to look at who's looking at what to be able to understand exactly the kind of, you know, gender dynamics, because I think that so far it has been dominated by men, and that might not be a good thing in terms of gender dynamics.
That's really good. We have got one last question, and I think it will be the last because time is really running out. Andrew, do you want to read this last question?
Yep. Because of the sensitive nature of your topic, do you ever find yourself in hostile situations or being kind of treated with suspicion? And if so, how do you deal with that?
I get asked this question quite a lot, and two things really. One is the kind of case scenarios that I'm looking at are historic, kind of time passes, and with the criminal underworld, things happen very, very quickly, and therefore when I'm looking at cases that happened 5 years ago, that's like, you know, 2 centuries ago for a criminal. So there's this time where, you know, what I'm looking at seems to be kind of less relevant. And the other thing is, I think, you know, a bit in relation to the ethics question, it's about being honest. It's about kind of accompanying. I have 3 or 4 different ongoing conversations with former criminals who want to share their journey. And I think it's not, you know, it's not a zoo. It's not going in and just sort of, you know, being an outsider, but it's about not necessarily a friendship, but a discussion, a conversation, where, you know, you can share, you can understand, they can make you understand, and to be careful. Obviously, you know, I don't put myself in situations of danger. I try and think about, you know, what could be a dangerous situation and how you navigate that. But at the same time, I think that I'm looking at things from such a far away perspective that that gives me a certain element of safety to a certain degree, I hope. But I think you have to be careful, but it's also about respect. You know, we're studying a phenomena. I'm studying a phenomena, and I need to respect that phenomena, and not, you know, I'm not a journalist. I'm not a police officer. I'm somebody who wants to get a close view, if I can, in order to be able to analyze it and to be able to, in a way, contribute to society to understand a phenomena that might not be necessarily looked at. So yeah, it's not it's not easy, but I think one has to be careful. And as I say, I think historically, I'm still kind of, you know, I'm looking at things that happened 5 years ago. That's just, you know, nobody's bothered about it, I don't think, in the real criminal world, or at least I hope not.
That's been really fascinating. Unless does anybody by any chance have a burning question that they must ask, even if they, you know, get it off the chest, because time is up and people are going to other meetings and so on. So I think if we can thank our speaker, I don't know if anybody knows how to use the applause function, but you're more than welcome to do so. Oh, hang on, there's something just popped up in the chat there.
It's just thank yous.
Just thank yous. That's okay. Right. So thank you so much, Felia, and thank you to all the guests. You will see a pop-up research survey coming up. It takes about 10 seconds to fill it in. If you can, we would be grateful. Thanks to everyone for coming.